we hate?
We hate because we're taught to hate. We hate because we're ignorant. We are the product of ignorant people who have been taught an ignorant thing, which is that there are 4 or 5 different races. There are not 4 or 5 different races. There's only one race on the face of the earth, and we're all members of that race, the human race. But we have separated people into races so that some of us can see ourselves as superior to the others. We thought it would work, I guess. It hasn't worked. It has been bad for everyone. But it's time to get over this business. There is no gene for racism. There's no gene for bigotry. You're not born a bigot. You have to learn to be a bigot. Anything you learn, you can unlearn. It's time to unlearn our bigotry. It's time to get over this thing, and we best get over it pretty soon. I'm an educator, and it is my business as an educator to lead people out of ignorance. The ignorance of thinking that you're better or worse than someone else because of the amount of a pigment in your skin. Pigmentation in your skin has nothing to do with intelligence or with your worth as a human being. It's time to get over that.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Umoja Circle. My name is Keith Smokey Johnson, and for those of you who are new to the show, the purpose of the Umoja Circle is to correct errors where errors are found and to introduce facts where we find that so many people are working on fiction when it comes to who we are as people of African descent. They should tell by the little video clip. There's a lady, her name is Jane Elliott. Some of you might be familiar with her, and I like her. She's a feisty, she's an elder now, but she's out there as an ally. And, you know, in all wars, even if there's a social wars, we need our allies who has always been around black people. They have been white allies. And the sad thing about knowing the true history of America is that we leave out those white historical allies who've always been with us, who've always made sure that they fought alongside with us, and some of them died alongside of us. So, you know, we've not always been alone as black people, but we have dealt with the situation ourselves. We have been in the forefront. I don't want people to think that we were given anything in the over 200 years of the American existence, or the 400 years of here in the diaspora, not only here in America but all across the diaspora. I'm talking about the Caribbean. I'm talking about in Europe. Black people have not just settled. There's been 246 uprisings. One of the greatest fears, if you read any of the white people's they wrote journals. They always talk about their fear of uprising on those plantations. We did not accept the fact that we were less than, even though the established order logic, and I'll get back to that terminology, said we were. I'm picking up where I left off on the last show. This is part 2 of a 2-part discussion on the history of racism. One of the things that always bothered me when I hear white people, especially young white people who have been miseducated, mostly all white people have been miseducated if they were educated in the system. You know, the system was not geared to teach black history. Pretty much left out most of black history. That's why there's shows like mine here. That's why there's documentaries. We need to speak, because black history here in America is American history. We've been an integral part of America. We've been the backbone of America. You know, America would not have reached its greatness without the labor of people that look like me. We were non-compensated, workforce. That's what we were brought here to be, not to be doctors, lawyers, or TV hosts. We were brought to be a permanent working force. And the fact that I have grandchildren in college, the fact that I'm here speaking to you in an articulate way, I was educated in the public system, but I also had a alternate education where I was autodidactic, self-taught, with books like the book next to me here to my left, and you're right. Let me start with this slide here. I started with this slide in the first part, so I thought I would start the second show with the same questions to answer, to enforce what Jane Elliott said in that video clip that started this second show. She said that there, there was a lot of ignorance out there, and a lot of the things that people are working on is ignorance. I also like to add that ignorance just means a lack of knowledge. The problem to me with the educational system is that it produces a lot of illusions. That means the assumption of knowledge, even in its absence. Columbus discovered America. The founder who owned people like me that kind of been left out. The manifest destiny that went across from the East Coast to the West Coast, leaving out the slaughter of Native people. Yet we got this illusion of American exceptionalism. Okay, but let me go back to this. Racism, what's the actual definition? Again, like I said in the last show, there's a difference between racism and prejudice. Prejudice is natural in all human beings. The reason that we are prejudiced, we could differentiate things that might be dangerous to us at the basic animal level, okay? I might be prejudiced against certain poisons or certain things. That's what prejudice, the natural state of prejudice is. It's discerning. You might not know the knowledge or the logic or why, but it might be dangerous. That's how prejudice functions in the animal. That is part of who we are, okay? But for the last 30 years, in this social structure that became the United States of America, we have been conditioned to believe that racism and prejudice are the same thing. They're totally different things, okay? Racism, by definition, is a power dynamic, is a power relation, is a system that was created for a particular purpose. Okay, the power dynamic between two groups, okay, where one group owns so much in the society that they can use their wealth and their power to deprive, hurt, and injure another group. And that's the power dynamic that was established by laws I talked about in the first show since the founding of this country, or since 1619, when what would become the embryonic aspect of this United States was established there, in Virginia in 1619, when at Point Comfort, you had a slave ship, the White Lion, drop off 20 African people. Now, the second question, how was racism established in America? Well, again, I want to reemphasize it, is by law. Laws are produced to produce certain type of behavioral patterns. I used the example in the last show of a red light. And I'll just do it real briefly, that we are conditioned right now, many of you who are my age or a little younger, we don't even think twice when we stop at a red light. We don't even, we could be talking to somebody and somehow we know when that light is red, boom, we stop. But we weren't born with that knowledge. There's a law that was established 100 years ago when the cars were first starting to promulgate the roadways. These laws produce certain behavioral patterns that's passed down generation to generation to generation. Same thing with black codes, slave laws. You think that it just stopped from 1619 because, no. By 16, within 10 years, within 20 years, within one generation, it has become a behavioral pattern that established the way one group by law is told that it has priorities over another group. And then you pass that type of law that's still on the books from generation to generation to generation, then it becomes a tradition. Which brings me to this quote that by Dr. Wade Nobles, he's a black psychologist, that says that the actions of a community, 1619, 1638, whatever community we're talking about, 1775, in the past becomes the experience of that generation. So whatever the choices and decisions or laws that were made at a particular time based on what was going on now at that time, slavery, separating one group from the other, slave codes, and that experience of that generation, how we interact, becomes the history of the next generation that follows. Now, while that same history then becomes passed down from generation to generation until it becomes part of the traditions of a people, it becomes embedded in the culture. So when you want to understand why, black and white people still have this tension between them, because the actions that were produced by laws that were passed down, again, even without any historical knowledge, but just the way my dad did it, that's the way my grandpa did it, but they were all following a law that was on the books at the time. So that becomes tradition. This is how I'll do it. I might not know the history behind it. I might not be taught what went wrong, so I may have choices to make to change the laws. So I steeped in ignorance. That's what Jane Elliott was talking about. Because some people want to stay in ignorance because they know the power. If they belong to a particular group that is dominated, that's traditionally been on the top of the totem pole, not only for decades, for hundreds of years. And each generation wants to maintain that status. And they're going to fight and do subtle things. Whether the laws change, maybe, but they're still going to do things. You get rid of the slave codes of the 1700s, then you just switch them up to have black codes of apartheid, segregation, Jim Crow segregation, doing the exact same things. We're supposed to have certain rights from the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, but these segregation laws produce the same type of pattern of not being able to live your best American dream. You're still limited to certain sections. You're still told there's certain towns you got to be out of by 6 o'clock, by sundown towns. You still got lynchings, okay, that went against the laws. There are many cases of where black communities defended themselves from white mob, but the black people in that community get charged with attempted murder for having the audacity, because by law, the dominant group, the dominant white group who attacked them, were shot at. That's the history of America. That's the reality of America that we still don't want to deal with. This racism. Even though slavery, the institution, is gone by law, supposedly, and since 1964 Civil Rights Act, which was one of 7 or 8 prior to it, but we always talk about the 64 Civil Rights Act, the Jim Crow segregation or apartheid reality went, but what was left over was the psychological conditioned racist culture that people still follow. That's embedded in the culture. We still have white people running away from where black people are moving into their communities. No different than the segregation laws. But now this is part of their culture, and automatically they moved away. They don't want to be around us. It's still happening to this day. There's certain communities, even though there might be black people in it, but you question what you're doing here. Why are you here? Do you belong here? These are traditions that were put in place by laws when you had the right to ask somebody that looked like me, boy, what you doing here? Show me your papers. Today, it's a question that's asked still. Even if you might be a FedEx driver with a FedEx uniform, you've seen we got terminology like Karens and Kens. Those are the people who still talk like their ancestors talked in the 1870s, in the 1880s, in the 1890s. When will it end? What is racism? It is a system, a structure. Let me use the example of a house. I think what's the next slide I think I have up? I want people to understand you cannot solve any problem found on this earth unless you first understand the history of that problem. Okay? Before you can ever understand the present moment, you must first understand how things got to that moment or the precedent, what came before. Understand, what does the term present mean when I say present moment? Really mean? It actually means the present moment. What I mean is present. It was sent to you from the past by decisions you made or a law that was made by the past that affect you right now in the present moment. It is the present moment. Okay? You go to a doctor, getting a loan, or even telling people about yourself, you always have to go into your past. If anybody that met somebody that was their friends now, when they first met them, they talked about your past. You cannot function as a human being without that knowledge. Yet we are told to be functioning as a society. Again, Elliot was talking about when she said ignorance. When she said the fact that it is a problem that we still have to deal with that ignorance. And for those of you I've heard this a number of times, which is the young folks who said, well, I had nothing to do with what went on in the 1600s or the 1700s or the 1800s or the 1900s or, I'm white and why am I getting penalized for something my ancestors did? Well, let me put it this way, in a good analogy, which I like to use. Let me use the example of a house. This house was built, let's say, generations ago, 200 years ago. You got a whole house. Anybody built, I've seen shows where they redo houses, right? You got an old colonial something up in upstate New York, all right? Normally, the owner of the old house knows that whatever you are ignoring will never go away. It will just get worse if you don't do anything with it, right? In the present moment. You're buying the house. It's an old house. But in that house is built with what was going on at the time it was built. But this is 21st century. You got to update it. You cannot just deal with how it was built. Any person with any sense will not move into a old colonial house that's 200 years old and just live there without fixing it. That's what you're trying to tell us, because racism was built like that house hundreds of years ago. And you're saying that with that logic that it had nothing to do with it, you're living in a society that is racist still. The house is still there, and the wiring needs to be fixed. Things need to be fixed to update the house. Racism needs to be, certain parts of those things need to be eliminated. And you're going to tell me that you are not going to do anything, then what Jane Elliott was saying is that, that's the problem. If you're white in America and you're saying that you had nothing to do with slavery, but that old house called racism is still functioning, and people are still forced to live in that society, including you, and you don't think you have any right to update it like you would do that old house, then there's a problem in America. That's our problem. That's our problem. If the work is not done, you'll never expect that house to fall apart around you. And that's what you want in America? Look at what's going on in America. The house is falling apart around us because of racism, because of the policies that are made and the decisions that are being made to do nothing. Let's get that straight. Now, let's go on to the next slide there. Okay, as it says there, during the 246 years of slavery, that's from 1619 to 1865, the first 246 years of America, black people by law were excluded, non-compensated, subordinated, and a non-competitive managed working force. I mean, we didn't get paid. There's free labor. We built the White House for free. We were excluded from going into the White House. Okay? We had no rights by law. The same Constitution you're talking about, conservative, that talked about, the founding fathers and all that. We weren't even 3/5 of a human being. Okay, and this enslaved society of that 246 years was kept in check by violence, to include the arming of white males with guns. The militia movement especially in the South, was created because of the fear of slave rebellions such as Nat Turner or Gabriel Prosser or Denmark Vesey that it had. We had, again, 246 slave revolts in America or across the Caribbean. And another point is that many of our politicians doesn't seem to understand, you can tell what problems will flare up in a society by first looking at problems that will flare up in the vulnerable enclaves, the poor, for example, of people in that society. The first people to get hit by COVID were the poor. The people didn't have much. People didn't have anything. The same thing happened, and you're seeing what enslavement did. You're seeing what racism is doing in the poor community with these bad police policies. Okay, if you don't pay attention to that it's going to migrate into the larger society at large. You're seeing decisions that are being made like DeSantis and some of these other Republican governors that are detrimental to everybody, but they focusing on their racist policies against blacks, people of Jewish descent, Native people, and they're making things worse. Don't you think that's going to infiltrate into the society at large down the road? These laws, these draconian laws, this is racism at its best, and it's still working to this day. It is expanding who they're going to have power over. And that's what it's about, maintaining the white dominant power. For example, in 1860, pre-Civil War days, people of African descent only earned 0.5% of America's wealth, while 99.5% of America's wealth was owned by white Americans. Yet we are told in 1865, when slavery ended, African Americans were free by law, but economically, we were socially engineered into a deliberately created underclass. But yet you're hearing people today, white Americans, saying, why don't y'all pull yourself out of a bootstrap? Why are y'all constantly being this segregation, racism of another 100 years after 1865 with laws preventing that to happen? And again, racism if the dominant group had the majority of the wealth. Look at 1860, 5 years before the end of the Civil War, before we were free. We were told to, we were free, but we're not given any kind of economic uplift. Even though foreign white people were given land grants and during the Civil War, Chinese were brought over here for their labor for the Continental Railroad, but they couldn't reap the benefit of that society. You had the Chinese Exclusion Act, laws. Again, That's why voting is important, folks, because the laws that shape the ideas and the ideas that shape the behavior. But what we get is an established order logic. And what that is, if I can find it here, established order logic is as it reads here, it's the dominant group's logic to justify the social system they constructed to maintain their dominance over other groups in the society. Okay? The established order logic is what we are dealing with. We got to change that logic because that's what you get taught in school. That's what you get taught in from the time you go to kindergarten, when you dress up as pilgrims, when you dress up as George Washington, and all the so-called founding fathers. You are taught the established order logic, but what does that got to do with a black child or a Native American child? See, that's racism. That's power. That changes. That affects the psychology. Because once you put your psychology in the wrong direction, so will your actions go. We have to understand the dynamics of how we're being conditioned to think. You wondering why those black cops beat up that young black boy? Because they were part of a culture. They were conditioned to the established order logic that says we do that because these people are criminals. It's the same logic that was used to produce slave patrols. Same logic. Laws that were passed. The first police station, official police station, was in Boston in 1838. I think the first modern type police station. So you think those cops in Boston was going to protect and serve the black community in 1838? Or they've been conditioned by a culture of established order logic that they're the dominant group, that these people are ex-enslaved people, that they're going to treat them differently. And that culture was passed down from generation to generation to generation to police departments all over this country. They have to deal with black and brown young men. The idea that established order logic is what they go by. And that logic has nothing to do, when she's talking about ignorance, that's what Jane Elliott was talking about in that video clip. That ignorance, because you have to twist that logic in order to justify your actions. I could go on for days just talking about this. But again, I'll try to introduce to the sources of my knowledge. This book right here is a good source. Before the Mayflower, History of Black America. And a lot of the stuff I'm talking about, you can find in there, and other books. But my time is up, and I do this for the honor of our ancestors. So until next time, peace, hotep, bye-bye.